Welcome to New Unrealist. Well, the Carter Page FISA warrant applications have been released. Well, a heavily redacted version of those applications, to be more precise. Now, just as I and many others had previously suspected, the whole thing is shown to be just a massive fraud by the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. First off, let's put the lie to the claim that the unverified Clinton campaign opposition research generated by Christopher Steele was not a significant part of the FISA applications. Not only is it a significant part, it comprises most of the reasons given why the FISA court should have granted a warrant to spy on Carter Page. Someone who was named as a foreign policy advisor for the Trump campaign for about 4 months in 2016 from the end of March to September, if you didn't know who Carter Page was. The first item they listed in the application was attributed to information provided by an FBI confidential human source labeled source number 1. We now know that source number 1 is Christopher Steele. They then obfuscate the true nature of Christopher Steele's work in assembling the information by attributing the ultimate entity behind his work to being approached by, quote, an identified U.S. person who we can infer was Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS. They then do the right thing by pointing out that Glenn Simpson was not just doing this out of the blue of his own accord. They rightly point out that Glenn Simpson's Fusion GPS was hired by a, quote, U.S.-based law firm to conduct research regarding Donald Trump, identified as candidate number 1, research into Trump's ties to Russia. Then, after having traced the chain of money and responsibility for the creation of the opposition research, 2 levels up through the money laundering and shell game set up by the Clinton campaign, from Christopher Steele up through Fusion GPS, then up to the law firm, which we now know is Perkins Coie, you know, the Clinton campaign and DNC's law firm. The FBI stops there, never identifying the ultimate source of the money and on whose orders the information was to be created as the Clinton campaign, which news reporting has said attributed between $12 to $14 million to this task, washing it through the Perkins Coie law firm, then Fusion GPS to keep the Clinton campaign fingerprints off of any of Christopher Steele's work product. Saying that the FBI speculates the opposition research's intent was to be used to discredit the Trump campaign is as useful as saying water is wet. One assumes all opposition research is intended to be used to discredit the target. This does not somehow erase the fact that they did not explicitly identify the Clinton campaign paying for and being behind the entire operation from top to bottom. This wasn't just no shoestring budget. They budgeted $12 to $14 million for this. The FBI then vouches for the information by noting that Christopher Steele has been an FBI source for some amount of time, and that previous reporting of his had been corroborated, and they judged him to be reliable. They worked with him on the, if you remember, the Russia FIFA bribery case where they alleged some kind of corruption within the FIFA soccer administration there. And I think it was around the time they granted the World Cup to Russia. But you know, they're basing the entire basis of their vouching for the information is the credibility of Christopher Steele. That's the most important thing you have to understand here. Nothing else is cited, just that Christopher Steele has been a reliable source. So they then note that Christopher Steele, that they judged him to be reliable and that they had paid him some amount of money. So that puts an end to speculation of whether or not the FBI actually paid Steele or not. They actually say it there in the footnotes that they paid him. Steele was peddling his dossier to the FBI from July 2016 until the FBI suspended and then fired him in October 2016, a month before the election, for what the Bureau described as the, quote, most serious of violations, close quote. The unauthorized disclosure to the media of his relationship with the FBI. It's hard to be an FBI asset if you start going to tell the media that you're an FBI asset. It was discovered that Steele was lying to the FBI throughout September and October about his contact with, news outlets like Yahoo News, several other news outlets like David Korn over with Mother Jones. By showing the dossier to several media outlets without telling the FBI, Steele destroyed the FBI's ability to keep track of the sourcing of the reporting. So leading to reporting from those news sources about elements of the Trump dossier using Christopher Steele as the source. So it's giving the illusion that there are separate sources basically confirming the Steele dossier, when in reality, he's the only source. Because these news stories, they're basically using him as the source, and you're using his own information to verify his information, which is double dealing. It's bullshit. This destroyed Steele's credibility and usefulness as an FBI source, forcing the Bureau to end their relationship with Christopher Steele. They had to get rid of him. They said, look, you're useless to us. Your credibility's shot. The problem is that in the FISA warrant renewal applications, the FBI does not inform the court that Steele was suspended, terminated, and no longer viewed as a reliable source by the FBI. It's unusable. So keep in mind that when they list these items to justify surveillance on Carter Page, it's wholly based on Christopher Steele, source number one, on the FBI saying they believe source number one to be reliable and credible. Steele's dossier claimed that Page, while on a publicly known trip to Moscow in July 2016, that's beyond dispute. He went to Moscow. He spoke at the New Economic School. Basically the allegation is that Carter Page had a secret meeting with two Russians, two separate secret meetings. One with Igor Sechin. He's a well-known Russian apparatchik. He's president of Rosneft, a Russian energy company. He's a well-known associate of Vladimir Putin. I believe he's been in the government even. Deputy vice president of something or other. That during this meeting, Carter Page and Sechin discussed future bilateral energy cooperation and lifting Ukraine-related Western sanctions against Russia. Well, we now know that's a bunch of bullcrap because Trump, number one, just came from the NATO summit where he openly lobbied Germany to end its dealings with Russia on natural gas purchases and pipelines. Oh, by the way, Germany happens to be Russia's largest energy client. In addition, one of the earliest actions of the Trump administration was to slap more sanctions on Russia over Ukraine, and even more significantly, reverse Obama's ban on selling weapons to Ukraine to use in their fight against Russian proxies in eastern Ukraine. Over $200 million worth of offensive weapons that were previously banned by the Obama administration. So in both areas of alleged discussion between Page and Sechin, Trump's presidency has resulted in the 100% total opposite outcome, severely damaging Russia's foreign policy interests. Steele's dossier also claims that Carter Page secretly met with Igor Devyekin, and that during that meeting they discussed giving compromising material to the Trump campaign on candidate number 2, which one assumes is Hillary Clinton. Again, neither of these meetings was ever proven to have taken place. Carter Page, for his part, denies they ever took place, and no witnesses to any such meetings have come forward. The entire basis for the claim about Page meeting these two individuals is solely from Christopher Steele, the FBI sanctioned, reliable, credible source who was fired in October and no longer deemed reliable and credible. Then 2 pages of blacked out redacted information that would be difficult to amount to much in the way of an item, for the simple fact that one of the pages is formatted to indicate that it consists largely of footnotes. You can't make accusations in footnotes. But the second page, it has a paragraph formatted to be an actual claim, but it's entirely blacked out, redacted, so I can't say what it is, nor could anyone else except for people like Trey Gowdy and Adam Schiff who have seen the unredacted applications. Now, for his part, Gowdy's only public comments on the Carter Page FISA application indicate he saw no verified information. Schiff hasn't gone into any detail on what he saw beyond his general protest that the dossier is not important to the application, which is difficult to sustain, mainly because the previous applications without the dossier were denied by the FISA court, which, if you know anything about the history of the FISA court, it's remarkable because about 99% of all applications in its history have been approved. You really have to have nothing to get rejected by the most rubber-stamped court in U.S. history. So after the dossier stuff and the 2 redacted pages, one of which is largely footnotes, remember, the FBI then lists a news article reporting the Trump campaign working behind the scenes to make the Republican Party platform, where they would not call for giving weapons to Ukraine to fight Russian and rebel forces, basically contradicting the Republican Party's foreign policy leaders in Washington on this issue. So, okay, except one of the first things the Trump administration did was to arm Ukraine in its fight against Russian and rebel forces in eastern Ukraine. This makes no sense. The FBI then cites another news article that noted how Trump sounded more supportive of Ukraine's territorial integrity in 2015, but more mild in his support for Ukrainian territorial integrity in 2016. Seriously? Give the FBI authorization to tap Carter Page's phones, texts, and emails because of spurious news articles about Trump campaign policy nuances being milder in 2016 than they were in 2015. What does that have to do with Carter Page being an agent of a foreign power? Who had the balls to include such stupidity in a FISA application? They go on in following pages to cite yet another news report published on September 23rd, 2016, that reported that Page was under investigation, saying that the FBI received intelligence reports that while in Moscow, Page met with Session and Devin. Well, we now know those quote-unquote intelligence reports were the Steele Dossier. So this is basically same source reporting. They got this from Christopher Steele. He met with them. He's the source. So they're using the same. This is another item in the FISA application, and they're citing the same source as the first claim. So, well, duh, we know that the report was using the Christopher Steele and his dossier as their source. The FBI, at least in their first application, was using reporting based on the same source. So they learned in October that this happened, that Steele was going around to these news outlets and peddling his story, his information, his dossier. But, in future applications, after they knew that he did that, they didn't amend the application to reflect that. So more lies, obfuscation, and inaccuracy peddled to the FISA court by the FBI and Department of Justice. Don't believe me? Here is the FBI representing in the application, in a footnote, that source number 1, who we know is Christopher Steele, told the FBI he only shared his information with the FBI and Fusion GPS, his employer. They explicitly state they believe Christopher Steele did not directly provide this information to the press. Well, they fired him in October, a month before the election, for lying to them about that and directly providing the information to the media. No changes made to reflect that going forward. The next item that the FBI lists in the same, they cite the same September 23rd news article in the next item about the Trump campaign making public statements that the news outlet interpreted as putting, I believe this September 23rd news article, if I'm not mistaken, was the Mother Jones article by David Korn. I'd have to double check that. So they quote the Trump campaign as putting some distance between the Trump campaign and Carter Page. And according to the article, Page was identified as an informal foreign advisor who does not speak for the campaign, which in hindsight really was the case. I mean, the foreign policy advisory panel that Page was part of, they only met one time, and it was more for a photo op than anything significant. I mean, they also cited a September 25th news article where the then manager of the Trump campaign said, was that Kellyanne Conway at the time? I'd have to double check that as well. But they said that Page was not a part of the campaign they were running, which is accurate. I mean, Page had by then ended his association with the campaign. The article went on to mention how Page was not part of Trump's national security or foreign policy briefings. Again, we know that because they keep records of who's in those briefings. Page wasn't in them. Next item. The application notes that Carter Page sent a letter to FBI Director James Comey on or about September 25th, 2016, denying the allegations made in the September 23rd news article about him meeting with Session and Devyekin. His letter saying he did not meet that year with any sanctioned official in Russia, offering to discuss this with the FBI and any final questions, his words, that they may have. Well, okay, but is this a reason to surveil Page? I mean, this is already sounding like the worst agent of a foreign power in the history of intelligence. He's writing to the head of the organization in charge of counterintelligence, at that time James Comey, and offering to speak to them about the allegations of him being an agent of a foreign power. Next item. Another news article. I mean, this is mind-boggling. They're using news articles to get a warrant against an American citizen. I mean, where Page again denies the accusation. It's basically an article saying that, wow, shock of all shocks, Page says, hey, I didn't do it. I didn't meet with this Session or Devyekin guys. And then the rest is redacted. So basically, in the end, so far, with the exception of the redacted portion, which we don't know about, so basically you have the unverified Clinton campaign opposition research compiled by the Christopher Steele, a now discredited FBI source terminated for cause for lying to the FBI once he was judged by them to no longer be a reliable source, a handful of news reports with no real intelligence reporting, basically, you know, the only source listed with regard to the Page Moscow trip is now in hindsight known to be Christopher Steele himself. So again, they're circling back around using the same source to verify the dossier which they presented as their main piece of evidence. A few pages of redacted material follow that, which for the most part, except for the 2 pages I mentioned before, all appear to be tacked onto the end where typically the least important items are placed. Now, given that Trey Gowdy, he's been a straight shooter on this, actually been one of the FBI's staunchest defenders, opposing Trump on calling it a witch hunt and other issues until very recently. This month, in fact, is the first month where Trey Gowdy has really turned. And I think it was the Peter Strzok stuff where it struck him just how biased Peter Strzok was. But Gowdy is one of the few people outside the FBI and the Department of Justice that we know for certain has read the unredacted Carter Page FISA applications. And as he characterized it, there was nothing he saw that led him to believe that Carter Page is collaborating and conspiring with the Russian government. So I have to say, in my opinion, if the first bunch of things you list is Clinton campaign opposition research and news articles that the only significant source that they use in those news articles is the very same author of that Clinton campaign opposition research dossier to bolster the initial tainted material, it's hard for me to see how the heavily redacted portions which come afterward, for the most part, are going to save this shit show. I'm not seeing it. Because we know that they tried to get a FISA warrant on Carter Page before these approved applications, and they failed in spite of the FISA court's renowned history of being a rubber stamp court. And the only major addition or change made to the FISA application that was eventually approved was the inclusion of the Clinton campaign opposition research generated by Christopher Steele. And what about that Steele dossier? What about the information itself? You know all the stuff about Trump and the P-tape of him with the Russian prostitutes pissing all over a bed in a hotel room previously slept in by the Obamas that Vladimir Putin supposedly has a video of, and I guess he watches it on the weekends with his buddies drinking vodka and chewing on popcorn. I don't know. We know where all that garbage came from now, thanks to the op-ed written by former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement and former Special Envoy for Libya, Jonathan Weiner. Libya, you have to understand where all these people came from before professionally. They have a history together, the people I'm about to mention to you. Weiner is friends and associates with Christopher Steele, the author of the Trump dossier. And guess who else Weiner is friends and associates with? Clinton smear merchant Sidney Blumenthal. Yes, the same Sidney Blumenthal who is so slimy and so shady, so compromised, that Barack Obama and his people in his White House forbade Hillary Clinton from ever putting him in a government job as a condition of him nominating her to be his Secretary of State. This was so important that Obama specifically singled him out, said you can never hire this guy that's in your orbit and for any government position. Sidney Blumenthal, his partner in crime, smear merchant Cody Shearer, Christopher Steele, these are all peas in a pod. These are people, these are the very same people who we now know were feeding Hillary Clinton all that garbage and unsanctioned intelligence about Libya, Benghazi, that we know because it was in the hacked emails that was released by WikiLeaks. We now know that the stuff with Libya was all made up garbage to further the interests of Sidney Blumenthal's clients who were pushing for regime change in Libya. I mean, this crew had worked together before on the matters regarding Libya, and they were Hillary's off-the-books source of intelligence, which we now know was basically all bad and false in the case of Libya. And as a result of the WikiLeaks revelations, I mean, that's one of the things that WikiLeaks revealed, that, hey, Hillary was getting bad information from Sidney Blumenthal. So here is Jonathan Weiner writing in the Washington Post that he met with his, quote, old friend Sidney Blumenthal, who he had known for 30 years, since that he met with him in late 2016. He'd known him since Iran-Contra. That was back in the 80s for you millennials. Weiner writes that he and Blumenthal talked about the hacking of that was in the news about Russia hacking the Clinton campaign, the DNC. Hell, Sidney Blumenthal himself, remember, I just mentioned his emails had been hacked back in 2013. And they were released. He was sending emails to Hillary Clinton back in 2011 about Libya. So the WikiLeaks revealed all the garbage that he was feeding to Hillary Clinton about Libya. So Weiner and Blumenthal, they discussed, those hacks. And Weiner says, Blumenthal, she shows him, I guess he casually shows him notes. Notice he had these notes with him. So that was the purpose of the meeting. He goes, hey, you might take a look at these notes by a, quote, journalist that Weiner did not know, Cody Shearer. Now, if you don't know Cody Shearer, he's no journalist. I mean, the last time he ever wrote anything even resembling journalism would be back in the 80s. So, Cody Shearer is a piece of shit. He's a cog in the Clinton machine. Weiner writes that he was struck how some of the material that he was being shown, alleging that the Russians had this compromising sex information on Trump, material of a sexual and a financial nature, how it echoed almost exactly the information that he had seen earlier in the month that Christopher Steele showed him. Wow, this looks almost exactly the same, except it looks like it has a different source. Weiner, after he met with Blumenthal, took a copy of those notes, showed them to Steele, and Weiner, I guess, was naive, or he's either naive or he's just pretending to be, I don't know. He says that, Steele says it's probably collateral information. Steele's words. Surprise, we now know for a fact that Steele was double and triple dealing at that very time in September and October of 2016. He was showing any and everyone he could his information about Trump and the P-tape stuff in a deliberate attempt to get it out there so someone would publish it. It's actually known now that he was frustrated that he couldn't get it out, that no one would print it, because he's basically the single source. So he's running around, he knew that it wasn't likely to get printed or reported with him as the single source. So the illusion was created by getting the buzz out there to as many news outlets, by showing it to people in the FBI, showing it to this guy Weiner at the State Department, showing it to politicians, getting it into the hands of people associated with John McCain. This Jonathan Weiner was just part of that chain, because then Weiner took this information to Victoria Nuland at the State Department, who then presumably took it to Secretary of State John Kerry, and then they reported it to the FBI. So now the FBI is going, oh, the State Department is telling us this. So with the FBI talking about this through Bruce Orr, husband of Fusion GPS, Russia contract researcher Nellie Orr, now they're getting this another stream of information from Bruce Orr. It's starting to look like this is coming from different directions, right? You've got Weiner pushing this into State, and then State goes to the FBI. You've got Bruce Orr bringing this from Fusion GPS into the FBI. So this is how they wash the taint of Sidney Blumenthal and Cody Shearer off it. Meanwhile, Steele is going to Yahoo News, Mother Jones, anybody who would take a meeting with him at that point to make it look like the Russian golden shower gate was real, coming from multiple sources. Of course Weiner was struck that the notes he got from Sidney Blumenthal that were made by Cody Shearer looked like the notes that Christopher Steele showed him. They were probably the same garbage written by the same guys all along. Look at the people involved. Cody Shearer was investigated in the 1990s when he represented himself in Bosnia, then at war. Wow, Cody Shearer and Sidney Blumenthal, again, showing up in a place to profit off of a war situation. He represented himself as an agent of the U.S. government and took cash from one of the warlords in this genocidal conflict. He was under investigation for that nonsense. Shearer and Blumenthal repeated their act in Libya back in 2011 when they convinced Hillary Clinton to take out the Gaddafi regime on behalf of their clients. Blumenthal and Shearer have a documented history of pushing self-serving lies, misleading foreign sources. Shearer certainly misrepresented himself as an agent of the American government. He never was. These guys are just masters of making fake reports, blasting them to all four corners of the compass so that, like the telephone game, the story gains credibility from the number of people reporting it. Sidney Blumenthal knows nothing written by Cody Shearer would ever be accepted as credible by any responsible person. Witness Jonathan Weiner himself explicitly says in his op-ed he did not pass his notes about Cody Shearer's P-tape claims to Victoria Nuland because he did not view him as a credible source. He knew he could not bring that into the State Department. But the very same reporting that he himself noted was remarkably similar to what he saw from the Shearer notes, that he did pass on to Victoria Nuland. Why? Because it came from Christopher Steele. Let me make this clear. This is my supposition here. I submit that the reason they struck Weiner as being so nearly identical is because they were the same source, either Cody Shearer himself or some other cutout. Christopher Steele was hired by Fusion GPS, which was done by proxy by Perkins Coie on behalf of the Clinton campaign because the Clintons knew that no one was going to take any info disseminated from Cody Shearer and Sidney Blumenthal seriously. So to take their stink off of it, they made sure to use the cutout twice removed, Christopher Steele, make sure he gets fed the Shearer Blumenthal garbage indirectly, and thus keep the Clinton name and that of their tainted associates, Blumenthal and Shearer, out of the news, out of the government's view, off of the information. Because if it had come out that allegations made in the Steele Dossier had anything to do with Sidney Blumenthal and Cody Shearer, just like the Obama administration did when they forbade Hillary Clinton from ever hiring Sidney Blumenthal, they would have taken the papers and physically thrown them in the garbage. No reporter, certainly no person working for a U.S. intelligence agency, would ever accept a document as credible that Cody Shearer and Sidney Blumenthal had any part in creating. And no one who didn't want to risk doing time in prison would hang getting a FISA warrant on a U.S. citizen working with a presidential campaign on such a document either. I mean, this is the whole reason that necessitated this ridiculous operation of the Clinton campaign, washing millions of dollars through their law firm, Perkins Coie, then getting them to go through Fusion GPS, to then use them to hire a foreigner in another country to put as much distance between them and the opposition research as humanly possible without farming the job out to someone living in a colony on the moon. That's all for this Neo-Unrealist. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, set the option to always, because the default option of sometimes it's not really useful at all. Thanks for watching.